They say wealth is measured in acres, in coin, in cotton bales stacked high enough to block the sun. But here, in Blackhollow, the measure was different. Here, prosperity was weighed in silence, in the kind of silence you only hear above the dead. The year was 1858, and the Vexmoor name had already settled over the Tennessee hills like a shadow no sunrise could lift. Their estate, Blackhollow Plantation, rose from the earth like an accusation, its white columns too pristine to have ever known honest labor, its windows reflecting not light, but secrets. By then, the fortune was undeniable. Cotton poured from their fields in quantities rivaling the pre-war trade ports, despite a labor force that seemed, on paper, barely half what neighboring estates could muster. Yet the ledgers glowed with impossible yields. The Vexmoors, people whispered, didn't just grow cotton. They grew something darker, something rooted deeper than any plow could reach. Ezra Vexmoor, the patriarch, moved through the county like a man who had already outlived consequence. Tall, skeletal, with eyes the color of wet slate, he possessed the kind of stillness that made other men fidget. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was with the patient cadence of someone who believed time itself would bend to him. His wife, Celine, pale, unblinking, her black hair always braided into a crown, was worse. She kept no servants inside the house, preferring to manage all domestic affairs herself. Those who were invited past the wrought iron gates returned with the same haunted expression. They could never describe what made them uneasy, only that they had the feeling of being studied, measured, weighed. But what drew the most attention wasn't the couple. It was the pattern. From 1854 onward, whole families began to vanish within days of taking work at Blackhollow. They were never seen in town again. Their wages, promised, generous, were never claimed. Inquiries met the same explanation every time: theft, drunkenness, sudden desertion. Always with witnesses, always with documents, always clean. And yet, the land itself told a different story. At night, some swore they could see lantern light bobbing out beyond the cotton rows, weaving slowly toward the low ground by the cypress trees, where the earth was soft enough to swallow a man without leaving a mound. 73. That's the number they whispered years later. 73 people who entered those gates and never left. And the deeper you go into the Vexmoor story, the harder it becomes to tell where truth ends and where the buried keep speaking. B. Why the summer of 1858, Blackhollow's reputation was already split clean in two. On one side, the local papers printed Ezra Vexmoor's name with the same reverence they reserved for railroad barons and legislators. On the other, the working men at the taverns spoke his name like a curse, quietly, eyes darting to the door as though the man himself might step through at any moment. The contradictions were everywhere. His ledgers suggested a man of obsessive precision. Every seed purchased, every pound of cotton weighed to the ounce. Yet, the human side of his operations was always shrouded. No public records of contracts, no burial markers for the departed workers, and never any bodies returned to families. The first to push back was Silas Brigg, a carpenter from Harrow's Ford who had been hired to repair the main house's third-floor gallery. He lasted exactly 9 days. On the morning of the 10th, his tools were found neatly wrapped on the gallery floor, his hat perched on top. Ezra told the men in town that Brigg had left before dawn, anxious to join a cousin in Georgia. But Brigg's wife swore he had no family there. She swore harder when she saw the farewell letter supposedly written in her husband's hand. The loops in the script were wrong. The signature looked practiced. That same week, a traveling preacher named Josiah Penn arrived in Blackhollow. He'd been moving between rural congregations, delivering his sermons on sin and salvation for little more than bread and a warm bed. But Penn's fire and brimstone style carried an edge. He called out hypocrisy where he saw it, naming wealthy men who wore righteousness like a mask. 3 days after his first sermon, he was gone. Ezra claimed the preacher had moved on toward Memphis, called by God to greater crowds. No one questioned it openly, except for the barkeep who swore Penn had told him, over a glass of watered whiskey, that there was something unclean on that property, something that stank of the oldest kind of bargain. And yet, cotton kept flowing out of Blackhollow like blood from a wound that refused to clot. Every wagon load seemed heavier than the last. The wealth ballooned. The town grew quieter. Even the sheriff, an old war hound with a backbone of oak, began looking the other way. By autumn, the missing weren't just laborers. A deputy vanished, then a midwife, then a boy barely 15. The pattern was no longer coincidence. It was ritual. Autumn came early that year, curling the cotton leaves to paper and casting long shadows that reached across the fields like grasping fingers. The air over Blackhollow thickened, not with the scent of harvest, but with something chemical, sharp, and bitter. It drifted from the low buildings behind the main house, the ones no outsider was ever invited to enter. It was in that season that whispers about the night wagons began. 2 of them, each drawn by a pair of black mules, leaving the estate in the deepest hours before dawn. No torches, no sound but the creak of wood and the muffled thump of their wheels over dirt. Those who claimed to have followed, always at a distance, said the wagons took the same path each time, down to the cypress grove by the river bend, where the fog sat so low and thick it could hide anything. The next morning, fresh earth would be turned where the mist had been. No markers, no stones, just the kind of disturbed soil that settles quickly when you know what you're doing. Ezra Vexmoor, of course, maintained his posture of gentlemanly calm. He began attending church more regularly, often taking the front pew and donating in such generous amounts that the pastor's voice would catch when thanking him. But inside those iron gates, the truth was tightening like a noose. The few workers who remained long enough to talk, quietly, in the weeks before they too vanished, spoke of the room below the cotton house, a place where no daylight ever reached. They said Celine Vexmoor herself spent hours there, dressed not in the fine silk she wore in town, but in a rough linen apron, her pale hands stained with something that would not wash off. Then came the story of Elias Boone, a riverboat hand who had taken short-term work hauling bales for extra coin. Boone was the kind of man who never kept his mouth shut. He told anyone who'd listen that he'd seen something in the cotton house basement. Rows of barrels marked with symbols he didn't understand, the kind that looked older than the English alphabet. 2 days later, Boone's skiff was found drifting downstream, or still inside, his boots neatly placed on the dock. The sheriff called it an accident. The river was high, easy enough to believe. But the river doesn't take boots off a man before it drowns him. The Vexmoors didn't just rule with fear, they ruled with design. You see, terror alone is blunt and messy. But when terror is stitched with reward, you create something unbreakable. Ezra understood this with the clarity of a man who'd studied human weakness the way others study scripture. The first layer was debt, not the kind that comes from unpaid bills, but the kind you choose, loans extended generously to shopkeepers, struggling farmers, even the church itself. Once you owed the Vexmoors, you didn't just risk losing your property. You risked losing your place in the invisible hierarchy that kept this county alive. The second layer was opportunity. Ezra had a habit of inviting young men with ambition into his orbit, dangling a position on the estate, access to profits, even introductions to influential friends from the capital. These offers came with conditions, of course: discretion, loyalty, silence about anything seen or heard beyond the gates. If you refused, the offer would vanish, and so would your business prospects. The third layer was something darker: dirt. Celine was the architect here. She hosted small gatherings, dinners by candlelight, where wine flowed freely. The guests left with hazy memories, and sometimes with a letter in Vexmoor handwriting that reminded them of certain indiscretions, ones they couldn't afford their wives, their congregations, or their employers to learn about. By the end of 1858, the town's leadership had been woven into the Vexmoor web so completely that no official inquiry could even be imagined. The sheriff owed money. The pastor owed favors. The mill owner's daughter had been courted, then dropped by the Vexmoor heir, leaving her reputation teetering on a knife's edge. When another family went missing that winter, the Nolans, an aging couple and their hired hand, not a single notice was posted in the paper. The postmaster simply nodded when Ezra explained they'd moved west for a new opportunity. Meanwhile, the cotton yields reached numbers so implausible that neighboring plantations quietly stopped trying to compete. The Vexmoors were exporting more in a single season than most could in 3. And with every wagon load that left Blackhollow, the silence in town grew heavier. The people weren't just afraid anymore. They were invested. And that's the purest form of control, when you've convinced your victims to defend the very thing that's killing them. It was January when the outsider arrived, a man named Nathaniel Cray, riding in from the east with the kind of posture that made people in the tavern set their mugs down. He wasn't from Blackhollow. His coat was too fine for a farmhand, but too worn for a banker. He carried no family name anyone recognized, and he asked his questions plainly. Nathaniel had come looking for his younger brother, Abram, a stonemason who'd been hired by the Vexmoors 3 months earlier to build a new smokehouse. The last letter Abram sent home had been in early November. It had spoken of good wages, steady work, and a peculiar cold in the walls of the house. After that, nothing. Nathaniel didn't waste time. He went straight to the plantation gates that first morning, riding past the small cabins where laborers should have been stirring to start the day. Instead, the yards were still, the chimneys cold. Ezra met him in the drive, dressed in his usual black, his gloved hands folded neatly behind his back. Celine stood just inside the veranda, unmoving, her eyes on Nathaniel the way a falcon watches a rabbit in an open field. "You're looking for someone," Ezra said, not as a question, but as a certainty. "My brother," Nathaniel replied. "He worked here." "Abram Cray." Ezra's expression didn't change. "Ah, yes, the mason." Regrettably, he proved unreliable. Left without notice. Took tools that did not belong to him. "Then you won't mind if I look for him," Nathaniel said. His voice was calm, but it carried an edge, the kind of edge that comes from long miles and longer grudges. Ezra's smile was small, precise. "You may ride anywhere on public road, but the estate is private land. I'm sure you understand." Nathaniel did understand, but he also understood something else. Men who are telling the truth invite you to look. Men who are lying build fences. He didn't turn back that day. He stayed in town, asking quiet questions in louder places. He learned about the night wagons, the sudden departures, the workers who left with nothing but a story written in someone else's hand. By the third night, he was followed. 2 men in dust-colored coats, the kind that don't draw attention until they're too close. That was when Nathaniel Cray realized his brother wasn't missing. He was buried somewhere inside Blackhollow. 2 days after arriving in Blackhollow, Nathaniel stood before the wrought iron gates of the Vexmoor estate again. The morning fog clung to the ground, thick and reluctant to lift, as if it too feared revealing what lay beyond. The gates were locked, but that didn't matter to him. Men who've buried brothers don't wait for permission to dig. He'd chosen the hour before dawn, when the town was still heavy with sleep. No lanterns burned in the cottages along the lane, and the only sound was the faint trickle of the river beyond the east field. Nathaniel carried no firearm. Guns were loud, and he wanted quiet, but the short-bladed knife at his belt had a way of speaking for him when needed. The fence was high, tipped with iron points, but there was a section near the orchard where the earth sloped upward. Years of erosion had shifted the ground just enough to give him a foothold. He tested it with his boot, then vaulted over in a single, practiced motion. Inside, the air felt heavier, like stepping into a sealed room after a fire. The estate was unnervingly still, no sounds of animals, no early clatter from a kitchen. The main house loomed ahead, its windows black, its shutters drawn tight. The long gravel drive was swept clean, yet no-wheel tracks marked its surface. Nathaniel moved toward the rear of the property, skirting the stables. That's when he noticed the strange furrows in the ground. Not plow lines, not animal tracks, but shallow trenches leading toward the far field. In the faint light, the soil in those furrows looked wrong, darker, wetter. As he crouched to touch it, a faint metallic clink carried through the fog. It came again, steady, deliberate, a shovel striking earth. He followed the sound, keeping low, until he reached the far orchard. There, barely visible through the mist, 2 men worked by lantern light. They weren't planting. They weren't digging for roots. They were burying something. Nathaniel froze, eyes narrowing. The bundle between them was long, wrapped in coarse burlap, tied at both ends. One of the men glanced up suddenly, scanning the fog. Nathaniel stepped back, slow and silent. He'd seen enough for tonight. But as he turned to leave, a voice drifted from the darkness behind him. Calm, low, unmistakable. I told you this is private land. Nathaniel didn't turn immediately. The voice behind him carried a kind of weight that demanded stillness, as if any sudden move might invite something worse than a blade. Slowly, he pivoted, the fog parting just enough to reveal a tall man in a dark coat, his face half swallowed by shadow. The man's posture was relaxed, but there was nothing casual in his eyes. They were fixed on Nathaniel with a precision that felt surgical. The lantern light from the orchard caught the faint glint of metal at his side, a long-handled spade, its edge caked with fresh soil. You're trespassing, the man said, stepping closer. And trespassers don't leave this property the way they came. Nathaniel let the silence stretch. He'd faced men who bluffed before. This one wasn't bluffing. Behind the man, the two workers had stopped digging. They stood at attention, hands at their sides, their faces pale under the lantern glow. One of them shifted nervously, but the other kept his gaze locked on Nathaniel, like a hunting dog waiting for the signal to lunge. I heard digging, Nathaniel said evenly. Figured it wasn't apples you were planting out here. The tall man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. You figured wrong, and you figured your last. The man took another step forward. The spade in his hand was no longer just a tool. It was an extension of his intent. Nathaniel's fingers brushed the hilt of his knife. For a moment, no one moved. The fog coiled between them like a living thing, and in the distance, a lone crow called from somewhere unseen. Then, without warning, the tall man slammed the spade into the ground beside him and gave a sharp nod. The two workers advanced, their boots crunching on frost-hardened soil. Nathaniel stepped back once, calculating. 2 against 1 he could manage. 3 maybe. But this was their ground, and they knew every inch of it. I'll be leaving now, Nathaniel said, voice calm. No, the tall man replied. You'll be staying. The first worker lunged. Nathaniel sidestepped, knife flashing in the lantern light. The second moved in fast, grabbing for Nathaniel's coat. He tore free, but his boot caught in one of the fresh furrows, sending him off balance. By the time he steadied himself, the tall man was only a pace away, spade raised high. The spade came down in a clean arc, its blade slicing the air where Nathaniel's head had been a split second before. He twisted away, the strike missing by inches, but the motion left him open. A hand like a vice clamped around his wrist, wrenching the knife from his grip. The other worker caught him from behind, pinning his arms in a chokehold that cut off his breath. Nathaniel bucked and drove his heel backward into a shin, earning a grunt, but the man didn't loosen his hold. The tall man retrieved the spade with unhurried ease, resting it across his shoulder. You've got fight. Good. The weak ones don't last long in there. Nathaniel's pulse roared in his ears. In where? The tall man didn't answer. Instead, he gave a short, sharp whistle. From somewhere deeper in the orchard, 2 more figures emerged, pushing a battered wooden cart. Its sides were stained dark, its wheels squealing in protest with every turn. The workers wrestled Nathaniel toward it, ignoring his struggles. His boots scraped across the frozen ground, kicking up little clouds of frost. When they reached the cart, one of the men flipped open its heavy lid. Inside, Nathaniel saw thick ropes coiled neatly, a stained burlap sack, and, lying in one corner, a small silver crucifix, bent in the middle as if someone had tried to snap it. They forced him into the cart, the ropes tightening around his wrists and ankles. The burlap sack came down over his head, the smell of mildew and something metallic filling his nostrils. Through the muffled fabric, Nathaniel could hear the tall man's voice, straight to the east wing. No stops. If the lights start flickering, don't look at them. The cart jolted forward, wheels bumping over uneven ground. Nathaniel tried to keep track of the turns, but the motion was disorienting. The cold air gave way to the faint scent of damp stone, then to a heavier, sweeter odor, like decaying flowers left too long in stagnant water. When the cart finally stopped, he felt hands lift him, carrying him into a place where the air was warmer but thick, oppressive. The sack was yanked from his head. He was standing in a high-ceilinged hall lit by chandeliers whose candles burned with an unnatural, bluish flame. At the far end, a massive set of double doors waited, carved with symbols that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. And behind those doors, something was moving. The double doors loomed taller than any Nathaniel had ever seen, each panel carved from blackened oak, edges bound with tarnished brass. The strange symbols etched into them seemed almost alive, twisting, stretching, and curling in ways that made his eyes ache. The men who had dragged him here didn't open them right away. Instead, they stood in a half-circle, silent, as if waiting for some unseen signal. Nathaniel's breathing was loud in his own ears. The air here had weight, pressing against his skin and settling deep into his lungs. It carried the faint crackle of static, like air just before a lightning strike. Somewhere beyond the doors, something moved. Not footsteps, too fluid for that, but a shifting, dragging sound like silk sliding over wet stone. A low hum began to pulse from the other side, resonating in the walls, in the floor, even in the hollow of Nathaniel's chest. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration that made the fine hairs on his arms stand up. With it came the faintest of whispers, dozens of them, all speaking at once in a language that felt older than the building itself. The tall man stepped forward, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor toward Nathaniel. He reached into the pocket of his long coat and drew out a key, long, slender, and black as coal, its head wrought in the shape of a serpent devouring its own tail. But before he used it, he turned to Nathaniel. "You're going to want to keep your eyes down," he said. "Looking at it changes things." Nathaniel's stomach tightened. "What is it?" The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Not what," he said. "Who?" A sudden metallic clang rang out from behind the doors, as if something massive had struck them from the other side. The workers flinched, but no one ran. Instead, the tall man slid the key into the lock, turning it with a slow, deliberate twist. Somewhere deep in the mechanism, a heavy latch shifted. The hum grew louder. The whispers sharpened into words Nathaniel almost understood, before dissolving back into chaos. The doors began to part, just enough for a sliver of cold blue light to pour into the hall, and the scent of something long dead to seep out. The blue light spilling through the narrow opening wasn't the warm glow of lamps or candles. It was cold, almost metallic, and it seemed to cling to the edges of the doors like frost. Nathaniel felt it on his skin before it touched him, a ghostly chill that sank into his bones. The doors stopped, barely a hand's width apart, but that was enough for the air in the hall to change. The scent deepened, something like old earth mixed with the faint sweetness of decay, the way a crypt smells when its stones are pried apart for the first time in centuries. Nathaniel's ears strained toward the gap. The whispers were no longer distant. They slithered into the space between his thoughts, crawling over words he already knew, trying to reshape them into something else. They weren't just speaking, they were listening. One of the men to Nathaniel's left swallowed hard, the sound sharp in the unnatural quiet. "It's awake," he murmured. The tall man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer to the door and placed his hand against the wood. It was almost reverent, like a priest laying his palm against a sacred relic. The door's surface seemed to pulse faintly under his touch, as though something behind it had shifted forward to meet him. Nathaniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He caught the faintest glimpse of movement through the crack, a shadow darker than darkness itself, sliding across the pale blue glow. But the moment he focused on it, his vision blurred, and a sharp pressure stabbed behind his eyes, forcing him to look away. The hum deepened into a slow, rhythmic thud. It wasn't machinery. It wasn't footsteps. It was a heartbeat. Nathaniel realized it didn't belong to him. The tall man finally turned to face him, the faint blue light reflecting in his eyes in a way that made them look almost hollow. "It's ready for you," he said. Two of the workers moved to Nathaniel's sides, each gripping an arm with cold, calloused hands. The doors groaned as they were pulled wider. the gaps stretching just enough to swallow a manhole. The blue light grew brighter. The whispers grew louder, and whatever waited inside seemed to lean closer, as if it could already smell his fear. The cold was no longer just in the air. It was inside him, as though the space beyond the doors had reached out and claimed his blood. His breath came out in sharp clouds, each one drifting toward the opening as though the light itself was drawing it in. The two men flanking him tightened their grip, and Nathaniel's instinct screamed to pull away. But the floor beneath his boots felt different, softer, as though the boards had been replaced by something damp and yielding. The sensation made his stomach twist. "Walk," the tall man commanded, his voice carrying no anger, only certainty, like someone announcing that the tide was coming in. The men shoved him forward, and the doors swallowed him in one fluid motion. The sound of their closing was not the slam of wood on wood. It was softer, heavier, like flesh meeting flesh. The blue glow surged around him, illuminating the space in jagged fragments. He caught flashes, the curve of a wall slick with condensation, the faint outlines of tall, narrow shapes along either side of the room, something metallic hanging from the ceiling, swaying almost imperceptibly. The whispers became a low chorus now, layered voices speaking in unison. Their language was still indecipherable, yet the rhythm of their words sank into his body. He felt it in his teeth, in his ribs, in the pit of his spine. A shadow moved ahead, tall, fluid, impossibly thin. It didn't walk. It simply shifted, like a shape seen through deep water, always bending away when he tried to look directly at it. One of the men holding his arm suddenly released him and stepped back. The other followed, their departure so silent that Nathaniel only noticed because the cold hands were gone. He was alone now. The tall man's voice came again, though Nathaniel could no longer see him. Closer. The shadow ahead tilted its head, slowly, as though in curiosity. The blue light pulsed once, like the beat of that otherworldly heart, and the room seemed to lean toward him. Nathaniel's foot lifted against his will. The moment his boot touched the slick floor ahead, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. The stillness pressed against his ears until he could hear nothing but the slow, deep thud of his own pulse. The blue glow dimmed, retreating into the edges of the room, as though something vast and unseen had inhaled and stolen the light away. Nathaniel's hand twitched toward his coat pocket where the folded letter lay. It felt suddenly hot against his ribs, as if reacting to the air around him. Then, something brushed his knuckles. It was not a hand. It wasn't even skin. The texture was impossibly smooth, slick like polished glass, yet warm like living flesh. It lingered for less than a heartbeat before withdrawing, but in that instant every nerve in his body lit with an instinctive alarm. The shadow ahead had not moved, but he felt its attention sharpen. A low vibration passed through the floorboards, traveling up through his boots, coiling into his bones. It was like the prelude to an earthquake, except the air remained perfectly still. From somewhere to his left, a faint creak sounded. His eyes darted toward it, but there was nothing, only the outline of one of those narrow, vertical shapes, its surface faintly glistening. He realized then that the smell had changed. No longer the damp, stale air of old timber and mildew. This was metallic sharp, like iron left too long in water. It filled his lungs, coated his tongue. The unseen touch came again, this time against his wrist. It was more deliberate now, almost testing the resistance in his arm. Nathaniel fought the urge to pull away, unsure if that defiance would be met with reprisal. The blue light swelled suddenly, flooding the space in a single, blinding pulse. And in that fraction of a second, he saw that there were more than one. Tall shapes, dozens of them, each impossibly still, each crowned with something glimmering faintly. But it was gone before his mind could place what he'd seen, leaving only the echo of the image burned into the back of his eyes. The shadow ahead moved at last, its form elongating as it leaned forward. Nathaniel's breath caught when the air around him shifted, not with wind, but with the subtle pull of something drawing him closer without touching him at all. The pull on his body was not physical in the ordinary sense. It was a command whispered into his marrow. Nathaniel's knees bent without his consent, his shoulders tilting forward, his weight drawn toward the shifting darkness ahead. Then came the sound. It was not a voice. Not exactly. It began as a faint rattling, like wind slipping through a field of dry reeds, then deepened into something almost human, layered and resonant. The tones clashed and overlapped, as though several throats were speaking at once, but never quite in unison. Found at last. The words slithered through him, bypassing his ears entirely and blooming directly inside his skull. The syllables carried a weight that bent thought itself, making him forget for a moment where he was or why. His hand pressed instinctively against the folded letter in his pocket. The paper throbbed faintly, as if responding to the sound. The figure ahead leaned forward, but its outline still refused to resolve into anything Nathaniel could name. A faint glimmer moved across where a face should have been, like light refracting through water. The voice came again, heavier this time, and the floorboards beneath his boots groaned in sympathy. The blood remembers. The smell of iron grew stronger. Nathaniel's mouth filled with saliva, but it wasn't hunger. It was a primal readiness, the same sick rush an animal feels when cornered. His heart hammered in his chest, yet he could not tear his gaze away. In the peripheral edges of the room, the tall shapes seemed to tilt slightly toward him, as though they too were listening. Something shifted in the air, a slow, deliberate inhalation from the shadow. The temperature dropped until the breath in his throat came out in pale mist. Then the whisper was right beside his ear, impossibly close, though the shadow had not moved from where it loomed. "Shall I show you what waits behind your name?" Nathaniel swallowed hard, unsure if the pounding in his chest was fear, curiosity, or both. The question hung in the air, so thick it felt like a living thing. Nathaniel's mouth opened, but the sound caught in his throat, his body waging a silent war between the urge to answer and the instinct to run. His pulse hammered in his temples, and the letter in his pocket seemed to vibrate with a subtle, steady rhythm, as if counting down. He felt absurdly aware of the fragility of his own voice, how small it would sound against whatever this was. The shadow did not press him, but its silence was worse than its words. It waited with the patience of something that had been here long before him and would remain long after. Nathaniel's mind spun through questions he could ask. "What are you? How do you know my name?" But each seemed laughably inadequate, like asking the ocean why it is wet. The air between them grew denser. The floorboards creaked again, not from movement, but from the slow, deliberate expansion of the thing's presence. The tall shapes at the edges of the room seemed to lean in farther, their silhouettes stretching unnaturally. He could feel the pressure of its attention, an invisible hand cupping his thoughts, weighing them. His breathing slowed, matching some deeper rhythm in the dark, as though his lungs were no longer entirely his own. Nathaniel realized then that the choice was not whether to speak, but whether to speak first. The difference felt crucial. If he broke the silence, he would be the one stepping over the threshold. If he waited, perhaps it would reveal more. But his tongue betrayed him. The words slipped out before his mind approved them, a whisper shaped more by instinct than intent. "Show me." The shadow stirred. Not closer, but deeper, as if the darkness itself had inhaled. Somewhere beyond the edge of hearing, something vast began to move, like gears turning far beneath the earth. A faint smile, or something like it, seemed to ripple across where its face should have been. Then stand still. Nathaniel froze, not from obedience, but because the room itself seemed to still around him. The air, once heavy, turned viscous. His breath left his lips in slow motion, hanging like smoke in water. The shadow did not move closer, yet Nathaniel could feel it inside the space where closeness existed. Around its outline, the darkness began to shift, not like curtains parting, but like fabric stretching to reveal what lay beneath. It was not a face he saw, it was a place. For a fraction of a heartbeat, Nathaniel's vision was yanked into something else, an immense corridor lined with countless doorways, each identical, each without a handle. A soundless wind pulled through them, carrying whispers in a language he almost recognized. Then the room returned, though not the same. The walls no longer met at right angles, their edges tilting inward like a house sinking into itself. The wood grain on the floorboards writhed with slow movement, forming shapes he tried not to recognize. Limbs, mouths, eyes opening and closing without lids. From somewhere distant but impossibly near, the sound of metal scraping stone echoed. It was steady like something sharpening a blade. Nathaniel's body begged him to blink, to look away, but the shadow's command, stand still, held him in place with an authority that felt older than speech. The letters in his pocket pulsed again. Only now did he notice they weren't keeping time with his heartbeat anymore. They were beating in sync with something else. The shadow's voice was lower this time, more intimate, as if it were leaning directly into his mind. You've stood on the threshold your entire life, Nathaniel. Now you will see what waits beyond. The darkness in the corners began to unhook itself from the walls, peeling forward like skin from bone. Behind it, no wood, no plaster, just a depthless black that seemed to tilt downward forever. And faintly, from that impossible descent, came the sound of footsteps climbing up. The footsteps were not hurried. They had the patience of something that had never been denied its destination. Each impact against the unseen stairs below was a deliberate note, spaced just far enough apart for Nathaniel's pulse to fill the silence between them. Step. The sound was weighty, almost wet, like leather soaked in water. Step. It grew louder, yet no motion disturbed the blackness. Step. Somewhere between one sound and the next, Nathaniel realized he was no longer hearing them with his ears. They were inside his chest, each step pressing against his ribcage from the inside. The shadow did not move to greet them. Instead, it seemed to tilt its head toward the darkness behind it, the gesture eerily human, yet wrong in a way Nathaniel couldn't place. Then the temperature dropped. Not the sharp bite of winter air. This was different. This was the kind of cold that came from deep underground where light and time had never been. It brought with it the faintest scent of damp stone and something else. Iron. The letters in his pocket throbbed violently now, not in rhythm with the footsteps, but in defiance of them, as though trying to warn him or fight something off. From within the black corridor, a shape began to emerge. At first, it was only a suggestion of form, like smoke struggling to remember it had once been solid. Then it coalesced, shoulders, a torso, arms that seemed just a fraction too long. Its head tilted forward, as if the ceiling were too low, though Nathaniel could see there was no ceiling at all. And then he noticed its hands. Both were clasped tightly around something wrapped in cloth. The cloth was dark with old stains, and as it shifted in its grip, a metallic clink sounded from within. It stopped just at the threshold, and for a moment, Nathaniel thought it might remain there. But the shadow spoke again, its voice cutting through the thickened air like a blade through soft flesh. Give it to him. The figure stepped forward. The figure's movements were deliberate, ritualistic. Each step closed the space between them without hurry, as though time had been arranged to allow for this moment centuries ago. When it finally stopped, the thing in its hands was inches from Nathaniel's chest. The cloth was not just stained. It was stiff, as if the blood had long since turned to lacquer. The smell rising from was faint but nauseating, a mixture of rust and something sweet, like fruit left to rot. The figure loosened its grip. The cloth fell away in slow folds, revealing a small iron box. Its surface was uneven, pitted with corrosion, and in its center was a symbol Nathaniel had never seen yet instinctively recognized. It was the same shape he had been drawing unconsciously in the margins of his notes for months. The realization froze him more than the cold ever could. He had never understood why his hand traced that pattern in idle moments, never questioned why the curves and angles felt inevitable. But seeing it carved into this box, its edges still sharp despite the centuries, made his stomach turn. The box emitted a faint vibration, a steady pulse like a living heartbeat. Every beat seemed to echo in the scar tissue of his memory, pulling at things he had locked away since childhood. The figure extended its arms, offering the box as though there were no question Nathaniel would take it. He wanted to refuse. His mouth even formed the words, but the sound wouldn't leave his throat. The shadow beside him leaned closer, its voice low and unyielding. You've carried its image for years. It has been waiting for you to open it. Nathaniel's fingers twitched at his sides, an involuntary spasm that betrayed the war between his will and whatever was binding him to this moment. The figure took another step, closing the last of the distance. The box was now directly in his hands, though he could not remember lifting them. The heartbeat within it quickened. The iron was cold enough to burn his palms, but Nathaniel couldn't let go. The weight of the box was disproportionate to its size. It felt like holding a piece of the earth itself, as if mountains had been folded into its shape. The heartbeat inside it had grown frantic now, each thud reverberating up his arms and into his ribcage until his own pulse matched its rhythm. The figure stepped back, as though the act about to unfold was not meant to be witnessed up close. The shadow, however, stayed at his side, whispering not in words, but in something deeper, a hum that resonated in his bones, urging him forward. Nathaniel's fingers found the seam along the box's edge. It wasn't a hinge. It was more like two slabs of metal held together by an invisible grip. His nails scraped along the groove, and with a sudden, almost organic shudder, the seal loosened. The moment the lid cracked open, a hiss of air escaped, not stale, but alive. The air carried with it a scent that made the hair along his neck stand up. It was the smell of rain on stone, mixed with the faint copper of blood. Inside, the darkness was not empty. It moved. A liquid shadow churned within, bending the light around it, swallowing the edges of the box. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat, and then, like a creature tasting freedom for the first time, it surged upward. It didn't spill. It reached. Thin tendrils of black vapor curled into the air, caressing his wrists, then wrapping them with an intimacy that made him shudder. The vapor didn't feel cold or hot. It felt like nothing, like the absence of sensation itself. The figure in the distance tilted its head, as if satisfied. The shadow at his side finally spoke in words again. It remembers you. Nathaniel wanted to drop the box, to fling it into the void, but his arms betrayed him. The tendrils tightened, sliding up to his elbows, then his shoulders. And in that instant, the space around him shifted like the world had inhaled. The cavern was no longer silent. 1,000 whispers began to speak at once. First, the whispers were incoherent, like wind threading itself through cracks in stone. But then, they began to align, not into one voice, but many. Male, female, young, old. Some screamed, some wept, some simply repeated a single phrase over and over until it etched itself into Nathaniel's skull. Bring it home. Don't let go. It was promised. The tendrils from a box tightened, curling over his collarbone like skeletal fingers. The liquid shadow inside pulsed, and with each pulse, the voices grew louder. He staggered backward, but the darkness followed, still tethered to him, dragging him toward the figure across the cavern. The figure had not moved, its robe unmoving despite the windless air, but Nathaniel could feel its anticipation. He looked into the box again, and in the swirl of that impossible blackness, faces began to form. They pressed against the inside surface like drowning people against glass, mouths opening wide in soundless cries. A child's face emerged from the darkness, skin pale, eyes like molten gold, and when it spoke, the voice was not of a child at all. You were late. Nathaniel's knees nearly buckled. The shadow beside him leaned close, its lips brushing the shell of his ear. Every hour you delayed, it whispered, the door grew hungrier. And then he understood. The heartbeat was not his. It was theirs. The figures in the darkness were not imprisoned. They were waiting for him to carry them back. The 1,000 whispers rose in pitch until they became one sustained note, vibrating the air, rattling the stone beneath his feet. Somewhere deep within the sound, something vast was shifting, something old enough to remember the shaping of the earth. Nathaniel gripped the box harder, the black tendrils now laced around his neck, his chest, like a lover who would not let go. And with every second, the cavern seemed to grow smaller, as though the world itself was folding in on this moment. The sound became unbearable, an endless metallic wail that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The cavern's shadows began to bend, peeling away from the walls as though they were being drawn toward a single, unseen point. Then Nathaniel saw it. The far wall was changing, stone splitting in thin, perfect lines. A vertical seam glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the box's heartbeat. Dust trickled down as the fissure widened, revealing not a door of wood or metal, but something far older and alive. Its surface rippled like the skin of a great beast sleeping beneath deep water. Veins of molten gold ran through its surface, shifting like blood in a circulatory system. When the seam finally opened enough to reveal darkness within, the air turned heavy, pressing against Nathaniel's chest like a physical weight. The figure in the robe stepped forward at last, its movements slow and deliberate, like a priest approaching an altar. It did not speak aloud, yet its voice was in Nathaniel's mind. "It has waited for you." The box grew hotter in his hands. The tendrils now burrowed slightly into his skin, not to harm, but to anchor him. He realized, then, that letting go was no longer an option, physically or otherwise. From within the door's black interior came a single sound. It was faint at first, a deep, slow inhale. The air of the cavern swirled toward it, as if the world itself was being drawn inside. Faces pressed against the golden-veined surface from the inside, mouths moving without sound. Some were pleading. Others grinned with impossible joy. The robed figure reached out, placing both hands upon the living door. Its voice in Nathaniel's head deepened, becoming more than one, layered with countless tones. "You are the last key." The door widened another inch. Something beyond it moved, something massive, coiled, and patient. Nathaniel couldn't see its form, only the faint glint of eyes opening in the dark. And they were looking only at him. The first word wasn't sound, it was weight. It pressed into Nathaniel's skull, bypassing his ears entirely, threading itself into his thoughts like a parasite wearing the mask of a whisper. The cavern vanished from his perception. There was only the black beyond the door and the thing that dwelled there. Nathaniel. It spoke his name as though it had known it before he was born. The syllables dripped with familiarity, intimacy, and ownership. He tried to respond, but his jaw refused to move. "You have carried me far, longer than you think." The box pulsed in his grip, once, twice, and the images slammed into his mind. He saw deserts that no map had recorded, oceans under twin moons, cities built upside down in cavern ceilings. In every vision, the box was there, and so was he, though he wore different faces. His breath caught. It was showing him lifetimes. "I have called you before. You answered. You will answer again." The robed figure was no longer beside him. Or perhaps it never truly existed. It was just another mask, another tether guiding him to this moment. "I can give you what the others could not," the voice said. "Freedom from the ache of time. The taste of truths your kind is too small to hold." In the black, something immense shifted, its movements so slow it was almost imperceptible. Yet the idea of its eyes was enough to make his mind threaten to fracture. Its eyes, those pinpricks of gold, grew brighter. "But you must open the way completely." The tendrils from the box dug deeper, and he realized it was not waiting for his permission. It was waiting for his willingness. A memory, not his, yet his flashed, a different life, a different hand, also clutching this box, also standing before this same door. That version of him had said yes. The creature's presence leaned closer, brushing against the edges of his mind like a tide testing the shore. "Say it, Nathaniel. Call me through." The black began to churn. Something was coming down. Nathaniel's knees buckled as the air thickened, congealing into something almost liquid. Breathing became a deliberate, painful act, each inhale dragging the stench of iron and ash into his lungs. The door wasn't just in front of him anymore. It was around him, sealing him in a place where direction lost meaning. The black space beyond it rippled, like fabric straining under a hidden wind. He felt the box tug forward, though his hands trembled, clinging to it as if it were both anchor and weapon. "Let me through," the voice urged. It had grown quieter, more coaxing, like a lover at the edge of the bed, whispering promises in the dark. "Why me?" Nathaniel's voice cracked. It wasn't defiance. It was the pleading of a man already afraid he knew the answer. "Because you always choose me," it replied. "In every life, in every form, we find each other. And each time, you open the way." A pulse of gold light flickered in the void, quick and sharp, as if something massive had blinked. Then the pressure surged, a tidal pull from behind the door that latched onto his bones. He dug his heels into the stone, but his own body betrayed him, leaning forward as if the very gravity here answered to the thing's will. The edges of the doorframe seemed to writhe, the carvings stretching into grotesque, unfamiliar shapes. What had once looked like ancient symbols now appeared to be faces, contorted in silent screams. He could almost hear them beneath the thing's voice, whispers of warning, of regret. "They fear the light I bring," it said. "They always do." The box grew heavier, its weight pressing into his palms like molten lead. His vision blurred, but he could still see the faint seam down the center of the door, thin as a hair, yet impossibly deep. It was opening. Every instinct told him to drop the box, to run until his lungs burst, to forget this place. But every thought, every memory, felt laced with threads that pulled him back, threads that weren't his. "Say it," the voice murmured again, softer this time, "before the choice is taken from you." The seam widened with a sound that wasn't a creak but a sigh, low, hollow, and wet, like the first breath of something that had never learned to breathe. Nathaniel felt his stomach drop as a draft of frigid air spilled into the chamber, curling around his ankles and creeping upward like smoke from a dying fire. The void beyond was not pure black anymore. It shifted, fractured by faint veins of dull red light that pulsed like blood through unseen arteries. Each flicker illuminated more of those grotesque carvings along the frame. Faces that seemed less like engravings and more like impressions, the frozen echoes of whatever had touched this door before him. The box in his grip began to hum. It wasn't just a vibration. It was a resonance inside his chest, syncing with his heartbeat until he could no longer tell which was which. "Yes," the voice whispered, with a tremor that could have been delight or hunger. "Just a little more." The pull grew violent. His body pitched forward, the soles of his boots scraping against the stone. His arms locked around the box, yet the sensation wasn't that he was carrying it anymore. It was carrying him, dragging him toward the breach. A shadow slipped through the crack. It wasn't mist, nor smoke, nor anything he could name. It was the absence of all things, folding and unfolding like a living silhouette. The room darkened with it, swallowing the torchlight as though flame itself were being erased from existence. Nathaniel's breath came fast now, his ribs aching. Every instinct screamed to run, to slam the door shut, but his legs refused. The box burned against his palms, branding a heat so deep it seemed to touch the marrow in his bones. From within the gap, two pinpoints of light appeared. Not eyes, not entirely, but they were fixed on him with the precision of a predator assessing distance before it strikes. And then, so close to his ear he felt the air move, the voice said, "You have always been mine." The seam tore wider with a sound like splitting bone. Stone dust rained from the arch, yet the frame itself seemed untouched by the violence. Nathaniel staggered back, but it was too late. The shadow was no longer seeping through the gap. It was pouring, a torrent of absence flooding the chamber. The walls bent first, not in the way bricks should shift under pressure, but as if the angles themselves had been rewritten. Corners curled inward, stretching toward him like the narrowing throat of a great funnel. The torch in his hand screamed, a high, thin shriek of burning pitch, as its flames stretched into a single thread before being yanked into nothingness. Darkness claimed the space so completely that even memory of light seemed to drain away. The box now writhed in his hands, its carved patterns shifting under his skin, rearranging themselves in symbols his mind refused to hold. His fingers locked against it, not in choice, but as though tendons and bone had fused into its form. From beyond the threshold, a form emerged, not flesh, not shadow, but a mingling of both. It stepped without sound, yet each movement left a faint afterimage in the air, as though reality lagged a fraction of a second behind it. Nathaniel's body began to tilt forward. He wasn't falling. He was being leveled, as though the chamber itself had rotated on an unseen axis. His boots slid along the stone toward the entity, and the cold air rushing past his face whispered with hundreds of overlapping voices, none louder than the other, yet all speaking to him. The pulsing veins of red light in the void beyond began to sync perfectly with the beat in his skull, until thought itself was reduced to rhythm. The entity stopped an arm's length away, its face, or the place where a face should have been, glimmering with faint, insect-like reflections. It did not reach for him. It did not need to. Come into the center, the voice said. It is where you began. It is where you end. Nathaniel's heels lifted from the floor as though the stone beneath him had liquefied into a downward pull. The box in his hands grew heavier, not in weight, but in presence, as if each carved groove was an anchor to something far older than the room, the abbey, or the earth itself. The breach yawned wider, its edges stretching beyond sight, until the idea of walls and ceiling was no longer certain. He could see stars. No, not stars, but points of red light suspended in a vast fluid darkness, pulsing in rhythms too deliberate to be random. Each one flared as he drew nearer, like distant eyes catching firelight. His body crossed the threshold with no resistance, and yet the instant his foot passed into the other side, his senses inverted. Sound came from inside his skull, while touch radiated outward from his skin in ripples. Time fractured, not stopping, not speeding, but looping, each heartbeat overlapping the last. He was standing, or floating, on a surface that reflected nothing. It was darker than shadow, yet held him as firmly as stone. The air, or the absence of it, vibrated against his bones, and the red lights shifted, arranging themselves into shapes. A crown, a wheel, an open hand. The symbols hovered, then collapsed into each other, becoming a single vast circle of light beneath his feet. Behind him, the breach still hung in the air, a ragged hole through which the ruined chamber flickered in and out of existence, like a failing memory. But it was shrinking. The entity moved ahead of him, each step dissolving the black surface and reforming it behind. It turned, and though it had no eyes, he felt the weight of its gaze pressing into him like the pressure of deep water. "You've carried it to the gate," the voice said, not from the figure, but from every red point in the void. "Now you must place it at the center and choose." Nathaniel looked down. The box was no longer carved wood. It was bone, veined with faintly glowing fissures. It pulsed in his grip like something alive. And far ahead, in the infinite dark, he saw the faint suggestion of a pillar rising from the void, its top shrouded in shifting mist. The pillar emerged from the void like a single bone from the skeleton of a dead god, white smooth, impossibly tall. Its base was encircled by the same red lights, but here they did not float. They were embedded, like unblinking eyes staring outward. As Nathaniel approached, they rotated in their sockets to follow his every movement. The entity stopped a few steps short, letting the silence grow until Nathaniel could hear the thrum of his own blood. It gestured toward the pillar, not with its hand, but with the slow pivot of its entire form, like a priest turning toward an altar. "Place it in the hollow," the voice said. "The center remembers all that is brought to it." Nathaniel's gaze fell to the pillar's base, where a shallow depression was carved, a perfect fit for the box. But the hollow was not empty. Inside lay traces of ash, fragments of something long burned away, and faint stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. As he knelt, the surface beneath him quivered, as though the void itself resented the weight of his decision. He ran his fingers over the bone-like box, feeling the warmth growing, the pulse sinking with his own heartbeat. It seemed to breathe in his hands. What happens if I do? His voice was steady, though his stomach was knotted. The red lights pulsed in unison. The chains will break. And if I don't, the chains will break. The answer landed like a stone in deep water, ripples of dread spreading through him. The choice wasn't about stopping something. It was about how it would be set loose. He hovered the box over the hollow. For a moment, the air grew thick, vibrating with a low hum that pressed into his ribs. Images flashed in his mind. Faces he didn't know, places he had never been, each ending in the same consuming darkness. The entity stood unmoving, patient, eternal. Nathaniel inhaled, his breath tasting of iron and old earth. Then, with a motion that felt both his own and entirely compelled, he lowered the box into the hollow. The moment it touched, the pillar cracked from top to base, wide, jagged fissures glowing with molten light, while the void around them roared like a tide, pulled back to reveal something vast beneath. The pillars split cleanly down the middle, the fissures widening until the halves leaned away from one another like the ribs of some colossal carcass. From the gap, a deep, radiant glow surged upward, bathing Nathaniel's face in shifting gold and black light. It wasn't fire. It was movement, billions of strands of something alive, writhing and folding back into themselves. They shimmered like liquid metal, but each carried a faint, needle-fine pattern, as though inscribed with an alphabet he could almost read, but couldn't fully comprehend. A sound followed, a note that was less heard than felt, a perfect sustained pitch that pressed against the bones of his skull. His eyes watered. His knees buckled. The void around the pillar warped, the red lights dissolving into thin threads that were instantly drawn into the glow, devoured without resistance. The entity did not move toward it. Instead, it stepped back, bowing its head, not in reverence, but in acknowledgement, like one sovereign greeting another. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. He felt his thoughts begin to dissolve at the edges, as if the light were stripping away the scaffolding that made him human. Words, foreign yet familiar, rose in his mind without permission. We have been waiting in the marrow. The strands coiled tighter, condensing into a shape. First a spine, then limbs, then a face that wasn't a face, only the suggestion of one. The air pulsed, and Nathaniel realized too late that the hum was inside him now, woven into his heartbeat. The glow surged outward, and the sensation was overwhelming. The memory of things that had never happened to him, entire lives lived in an instant. 1,000 deaths, 1,000 births, entire civilizations rising and falling in silence. When the voice spoke again, it wasn't the entities. It was the thing from the pillar, soft, unhurried, infinite. The chains are gone. The marrow is open. You may leave now, if there is still a place for you to go. The glow reached for him, not with hands, but with a pressure that seeped into his skin and curled around his spine like a slow exhale. Nathaniel's boots scraped backward instinctively, but there was no traction here. No floor, only the illusion of one. The entity made no move to stop him. In fact, it watched with something bordering on amusement, its head tilted slightly, as if it had been anticipating this exact moment. The voice came again, though now it was softer, more intimate, like someone whispering into his skull from the inside. Step into the marrow, Nathaniel. You will not drown. You will only forget. The thought of forgetting should have filled him with dread, but instead, it tempted him. The memories of what he had endured, the faces, the screams, the smell of rotten places that had never seen daylight, pressed heavy on his mind. What would it mean to drop it all? To be free of himself? The glow pulsed, and the strands bent toward him, forming a narrow passage, an open wound in the fabric of the void. The walls of this wound shifted constantly, like muscle under translucent skin, and deep inside he saw glimpses, a forest of bone-white trees dripping with black ichor, a sky that moved like water, 1,000 doorways that opened and closed in silence. He hesitated at the threshold, feeling the temperature shift, not cold, not hot, but an absence, as if every physical sensation was being subtracted from him one by one. Behind him, the entity spoke for the first time in its own voice. "You won't come back. You know that." Nathaniel turned slightly, enough to meet the hollow gaze beneath its veil. "Maybe I don't want to." Then Amaro's pull became irresistible, not violent but absolute. His body lifted, weightless, drawn forward by an unseeable current. The passage widened just enough to accept him, and the last thing he saw the void was the entity lowering its head, not in farewell, but in satisfaction. The world dissolved into marrow. There was no entry, no crossing. One moment Nathaniel was at the threshold, and the next the marrow was inside him, threading itself through the gaps in his mind like a parasite learning to speak in his voice. He looked down, or thought he did, and saw himself from 10 years ago, then 20, then as a child, all at once, like overlapping photographs bleeding into each other. His body was not gone, but no longer obeyed the sequence of years. The marrow's world had no ground, no ceiling, no air. It was an endless suspension inside something alive. The walls of this place contracted and expanded as if breathing, each inhale pulling distant shapes into focus, each exhale dissolving them again. Some were places he remembered: his father's study, the graveyard behind the church, the cellar door in Ravenshade he swore never to open. Others were not his memories, yet they clung to him as if they had always been. A boy with no eyes walked past him carrying a lantern that dripped shadow. An old woman leaned against a crooked pillar, whispering the names of people Nathaniel had killed, though he had never killed anyone. A door floated by, unmoored from any wall, and when he touched the handle his teeth ached as if each one had been pulled. The marrow spoke, but now it wore his voice perfectly. "All that you were is irrelevant. Here, your only function. You're a shape we needed." "What function?" he asked, though the sound didn't leave his mouth. It unspooled into the air like silk. The marrow didn't answer directly. Instead, the space around him bent, and Nathaniel found himself looking at an ocean of faces, each one screaming in complete silence. He realized, with a sickness that knotted his insides, that every face was his own. The marrow pulsed again, and all those faces began to sink beneath its living surface, one by one, until only he remained, alone, but no longer certain which Nathaniel he was. Then it whispered, almost tenderly, "Now we begin." The marrow didn't strip his identity away all at once. It peeled it. First went his name, not the sound of it, but the ownership. Nathaniel felt it slide from his mind like a paper slipping in a fire. He could still hear the word Nathaniel, but it no longer belonged to him. It was just a label floating somewhere in the dark, waiting for anyone to claim it. Next went his memories of choice. He could still remember walking into rooms, picking up objects, speaking to people, but every instance of decision felt like it had been staged long before he acted. The marrow showed him the strings that had been pulling him since before his birth, and some of those strings ran backward into time. His voice began to echo differently, less like a man speaking and more like an instrument being played by unseen hands. Each word had a weight to it, as if it was designed not to express, but to bind. Images came in bursts. A house he had never seen, but somehow owned. A woman's face half erased, her mouth moving silently. The sigil carved into the back of his own skull, impossible for him to touch. The marrow's whispers thickened, layering over each other until they formed a constant hum inside him. It wasn't just telling him things, it was replacing the architecture of his thoughts. Ideas that once felt like his now arrived, already formed, already approved. He tried to recall the feel of his own heartbeat, and found nothing. The pulse he heard now came from the marrow itself, sinking him to a rhythm he had no power to resist. Then came the final theft, his reflection. In his mind's eye, he turned to see himself one last time. But the figure looking back was smiling in a way Nathaniel never could. And when it spoke, the voice was entirely the marrow's. "We have refined you." The darkness around him contracted like a lung at the end of a breath, and Nathaniel realized that he was the breath, and the marrow had just inhaled, When Nathaniel opened his eyes, there was light. Not the warm, familiar light of morning, but a pale, anemic glow, like sunlight that had been strained through bone. He was standing in what looked like his own street. The houses were there, but their proportions felt wrong, too narrow in some places, stretched in others, as if the whole neighborhood had been rebuilt from memory by someone who had only heard of houses but never seen them. The air was dense, humming faintly. It carried the smell of copper and something sweeter, like rotting fruit wrapped in cloth. Nathaniel's neighbors were outside, but they moved with a strange unity, their steps perfectly in sync. No one spoke, yet their heads turned toward him as one, their eyes following him with a slow, deliberate precision. He called out, half to prove he could still speak, half to shatter the eerie quiet. But his voice came out with an unnatural resonance, as though the marrow was still inside it, speaking with him. One of the neighbors, a woman he thought he knew, broke from the synchronized group and approached. Her movements were too smooth, like joints bending without muscle resistance. She stopped only inches from his face, her lips parting just enough to let out a whisper. "They said you would be here." Nathaniel stepped back, heart hammering, but then realized the pounding wasn't coming from inside his chest. It was coming from beneath the ground, deep and steady, as if the whole world had a heartbeat. He looked up. The sky was fractured, streaked with faint, moving cracks that didn't belong to clouds. Something was looking through them, watching. Nathaniel finally understood. He hadn't returned to his reality. He had been inserted into another, one that wore his reality skin like a mask. And in this place, he was no longer just a man. He was the marrow's emissary. Nathaniel's breath fogged in the cold air, though the ground beneath his feet still felt faintly warm, like standing on a body that hadn't finished cooling. The woman didn't move. She just stared, unblinking, until something shifted in her eyes, like a ripple in water. And then Nathaniel saw it. Deep in her pupils, behind the reflection of his own face, there was a shape. A long, pale form coiled like a spine. Without warning, her mouth opened impossibly wide, not with a scream, but with a voice that didn't belong to her. "You carry the marrow. You are the bridge." The others began to step closer. They moved in perfect concentric circles around him, each face drained of color, each body stiff like marionettes. "You will teach them hunger," the voice continued. "You will open their bones, as yours was opened." Nathaniel shook his head violently. "I'm not." But he stopped, because in the corner of his vision, at the edges where the fractured sky bled into the street, the other world was bleeding through black fields, bone trees, rivers of pale, shifting flesh. And something inside him responded. His stomach cramped violently, but it wasn't hunger for food. It was hunger for inside. The voice in the woman's mouth deepened. "The marrow is not a parasite. It is an heirloom. You're the first to bear it in this place. You will not leave until the taking is done." Nathaniel's knees weakened. His hands trembled, but they weren't entirely his hands anymore. The veins beneath his skin seemed to be moving, slithering, rearranging themselves into branching patterns like roots. The crowd closed in, not to harm him, but to kneel. Every one of them lowered their heads until their foreheads touched the warm ground, waiting for something, waiting for him. Nathaniel realized with a chill that the marrow hadn't just chosen him. It had crowned him. Nathaniel's breath came slow now, not from fear, but from something far worse. Acceptance. The warmth beneath his feet spread upward, curling through his legs like molten metal, fusing bone to bone. He felt the marrow inside him, no longer silent, no longer waiting, singing. The song had no words, yet he understood every command. The kneeling figures before him shivered, as if sensing the change. Some began to sob, not in grief, in devotion. Nathaniel reached for the nearest one, a man whose neck was already streaked with pale lines like cracks in porcelain. His fingers tightened, and as his grip closed, the man's body seemed to soften. There was no blood, no tearing. The skin simply gave way, parting to reveal the pure, glistening marrow within. The scent was indescribable. Not rot, not life. Something older than both. The hunger roared. Nathaniel bent forward, his teeth sinking where no mouth should ever touch, and the moment the marrow met his tongue, the sky above them screamed. The black clouds twisted into spirals, the light fractured into shards, and the ground trembled as if a door had been kicked open in the fabric of the world. One by one, the kneeling figures crawled toward him, offering their arms, their ribs, their spines. And Nathaniel, king of the hollow bone, fed. In the distance, beyond the dissolving streets, the bone trees swayed and reached. They were coming for him, not to take him away, to welcome him home. And in that final moment, Nathaniel understood the truth that had been whispered in every shadow since the first bone was cracked open. The marrow had never been a curse. It was a throne, and if this tale left you wondering what else the world is hiding in its darkest corners, know this: some stories don't end. They wait. Subscribe to DeadScroll now, because the next one might already be at your door.